Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and I have the pleasure today to talk to you a little bit about temperature and a little bit about precipitation and how some of these important abiotic factors contribute to, in the rays of the sun, to climate. I know you're thinking climate, how does it relate to biology? But it does, it really does. It relates to the ecology of the fact that organisms are distributed based upon these abiotic factors, and it's these larger climate events and smaller microclimates that will determine, for example, where not only where organisms live, but how they get along. And not only that, but climate will determine the physical nature of a particular area of the ecosystem, and therefore it'll determine what types of plants can live there, and therefore what types of animals will live there. And so it's actually a rather important topic. And so let's jump right into this conversation if we can make that a little bit larger. So right out of the gate, it's a beautiful painting here of Half Dome in Yosemite National Park. This is the Yosemite Valley here. And so what I want to say is when you consider the what biome you're dealing with, whether or not there's conifers there, or if there's a grassland, or what sort of vegetation is grown in the area, the two major abiotic factors that we always want to consider is the temperature and the water. These are the major ones. And it determines what organisms can live there. And so to define climate, it's the prevailing weather condition in the particular area. And so there's several factors, but temperature, water, light, wind are the major forces in climate. And so I really like this particular graph here, this climograph, where it considers both precipitation, which is down here on the x-axis. And so over here it's a lot of rainfall, over here it's not, and then temperature. And so this is again in Celsius, and so just your sort of room temperature is around 25 degrees, 37 is body temperature, so 32 is pretty warm. This is of course freezing. So you go from cold to very hot, from very little water to very, very much a lot of water. And so look at this, you could sort of graph the different biomes based on these two abiotic factors. Isn't this interesting? So I'm thinking of a place that has a lot of precipitation and that it's very warm. And so we're looking at the jungle. It's a tropical, very warm forest, as opposed to over here where it's not as much rainfall. Do you see how the rainfall is a little bit less and a little bit cooler? And so we'd call that a temperate forest. And so over here, look at this. Here is very dry but yet still warm, desert. And then over here, you get this Arctic or tundra, Arctic or alpine tundra. It's kind of a very high altitude or very high latitude, and so it's kind of dry, even though it snows, but it's dry and cold. So you get a little bit of a desert thing happening based on just temperature, though. Do you see how both of those exhibit very little precipitation, but one's hot and one's cold? It's kind of interesting. And so overall, and I think this might be common knowledge, but overall climate patterns have a lot to do with the sun. And so the sun's movement, the fact that the earth is circulating around the sun, the fact that the earth has a slight tilt to it allows for seasons, but more importantly, it's when the sun's warming effect comes in, when the rays are hitting the earth, it's mostly warm in the equator. So it's the rays are hitting directly, and up north and south in the poles of the planet Earth, it's generally cooler. And so you can see how it's gradiated this way. And what's interesting is the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere are sort of mirror images of one another this way. And it's this, the sun's effect is beyond that because it also affects the temperature of the ocean and the currents, and it also affects evaporation, and so you get moisture around the equator, and so it's raining a lot more. And so these are ultimately the source of a lot of our climate functionality. And so here you can see the direct light is hitting here, and then here it's a lower angle, so it's a little bit cooler. And 30 degrees north is very similar to 30 degrees south. And so when you look at something like, okay, that's the planet Earth. When you look at something locally, like for example here in California, you might notice, like for example, in seasons, even though this isn't really a picture showing that, but I'll discuss it. In the Central Valley of California, do you see located right in here, Central Valley, in the summer it gets pretty hot. And as it gets really hot, what will happen is it'll cause the evaporation of the water to come up like this, and then it'll draw in the air, and it'll cause a lot of fog to exist, like for example in San Francisco. And so that's why San Francisco in the summer is pretty foggy. But again, that's not a bad thing per se because it keeps the temperature cool, and again, the redwood trees like that moisture. But what this is showing is that when the air rises up like this the ocean is bringing in a lot of the water, there's a lot of moisture then is drawn in an easterly direction. And as it moves up to higher altitudes, what happens is the water will condense and it'll begin to rain. And over on the western side of the mountain, as you can see here, there'll be a large amount of precipitation. And then when the cloud gets a little bit higher up, and if it's still containing water, it might actually snow up here in the top. But then when over on the east side, it's very arid and dry. And so it's kind of like a shadow. If you were standing here, you're casting a shadow. Over here is dry and over here is moist. And so this is called rain shadow. And so the currents of the earth of the ocean, the clouds, the precipitation, the mountains, all of these things affect local climate. And so you can see here that there's a big difference in vegetation. Like over on the western side of the Sierra Nevada, you'll see a coniferous forest. Even down here, you'll see like for example, a savanna and then some grassland over here. But then it'll snow on the top, but then there's no more moisture as it comes over the mountain, so it's very dry. It's like desert-like over in Nevada. Another picture of this, as you can see, like the precipitation is happening here, and then it snows and then dry. Now we actually could back this up with real numbers. You could look here, notice how the darker blue colors is the most precipitation. Do you notice here that it's over on the western slope of the Sierra Nevada? Down here it's very dry and deserty. Another interesting consideration when you're looking at climate and temperature, and you can look at in terms of water. Like for example, in a high Sierra lake or a high mountain lake, high altitude lake, it might be snowing in the wintertime. And as you may know, when it snows in the wintertime, water is less dense when it's frozen, and so it'll appear on the very top, and so that's 0 degrees Celsius. Because of the fact it sort of insulates, the temperature is actually warmer. So it's kind of a funny thing when you go to a frozen lake and you're like, well, if it's freezing on the top, it really must be freezing on the bottom of the lake. Actually, it's not. The true temperature of water when it's most dense is 4 degrees Celsius. And so I could tell you, the bottom of Lake Tahoe, 4 degrees. The bottom of the ocean, 4 degrees. This is what most dense. And so as it turns out, what this is, the different colors is showing the levels of dissolved oxygen in the water. And so you can see that the dark blue is carrying a lot of oxygen right in here. But check this out. In the summertime, after winter comes spring. So when it warms up, what's going to happen is the ice is going to melt, and so it'll get a little warmer. So it'll be 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4, and then in the spring, when it's 4 degrees, check this out, the whole lake is 4 degrees. And so when the water is the same temperature, it allows for it to circulate more freely, and so therefore it's able to move the dissolved oxygen. Check this out. The dissolved oxygen is the same no matter what the depth is in the lake. And so not only that, a lot of the nutrients on the bottom of the lake, like for example, the detritus from dead organisms in the lake, allows some of those mineral elements to then circulate back up to the top. I mean, we're looking at just oxygen circulation, but a lot of nutrients are circling as well. So the fact that the temperature is warming up helps to circulate the dissolved oxygen more uniformly, and therefore the fish benefit as a result of that. And then, okay, after spring comes the summer, and then it's getting very warm. You'll notice at the very top, because the sun is shining, is very, very warm. And so the algae, for example, is living at the very top of the lake, and so it's creating a lot of photosynthesis, and therefore you can notice how the oxygen is a lot more at the top. But yet it's still kind of barren down in the depths at the 4 degrees. Even in the summer, the lake is pretty cold. It's 4 degrees at the bottom. I find that kind of interesting, that even in the winter and in the summer, it's still 4 degrees. But then check this out. You want all that good oxygen to be circulated. So in the autumn, in the fall, it gets cooler. Notice the leaves are changing. Once it's 4 degrees, then it circulates again, and so therefore the oxygen is evenly distributed. So there's some turnover. It's a physical event that allows oxygen to maintain a nice equilibrium two out of the 4 seasons. Kind of cool. And so this is a real picture of a high mountain lake. We're going to be taking a field trip here. This is May Lake in Yosemite. I wouldn't necessarily recommend walking across it, but if you were brave enough, you could do it. This is what it looks like in the summertime. It's a beautiful high Sierra lake, and at the bottom of this lake, it's probably 4 degrees. Now, even still, we could consider climate on a smaller, even more local level. There's something called microclimate. In other words, whether or not ferns could live on the ground in a forest, or whether or not this redwood swirl can grow, is more to do with the local climate. In other words, the competition from the canopy, from the bigger trees, or the moisture in this area. Whether or not, like, a roly-poly is going to survive because it lives under a rock or a rotting log. Or we can consider underneath a rock in a river. These are what are called microclimates, and it might be more appropriate, depending on what organism you're studying, to be considering microclimates. And so they can vary on a small scale as well. And so sometimes more practically, we consider the forest floor microclimate versus the rays of the sun, for example, in terms of the north and south poles. Like, for example, if we're looking at this river right here, the microclimate is the fact that, do you see how the water is running over these rocks right here? This is called riffles. And so that's circulating the water, and therefore it's aerating it. And so that's maybe a good area for fish. And, like, for example, when a tree falls, that could actually cause a pool to form behind it, and therefore fish could lay eggs there, and they could be safe in those pools. For example, if a log falls, it could provide shade from direct sunlight, and the temperature in the pool remains cool, and therefore it holds more oxygen, for example. And so sometimes it's more appropriate to consider things on a microclimate scale. So I hope you enjoyed this video on climate and ecology. Thanks for watching.